Kellogg's Global Politics, a podcast on current events in U.S. foreign policy and international affairs. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, an international relations scholar specializing in the relationship between economics and national security. I'm here with my co-host, Ryan Kellogg, an expert in energy investment and policy.
Thanks, and glad to be back. So this is episode 35, and we're recording this on June 3rd, 2023.
On this episode, I speak with Deborah Larson, a research professor at the University of California, Los Angeles. As a former student of hers while undertaking my Ph.D. at UCLA, I found her research on Russia's leaders very insightful. More recently, she's been writing about the China-Russia relationship, which we discuss. In particular, we look at what China gets out of the relationship, how far it will go to support Russia in Ukraine, and how Russia avoids being the little brother in the strategic partnership. We begin the episode by delving into the most recent developments in the Russia-Ukraine war, including speculation on Ukraine's future counteroffensive, the impact of the F-16s now being provided to Ukraine, and possible NATO membership. El Salvador's president has become the latest authoritarian-leaning darling of the right in the U.S. We discuss why he has received so much praise from the likes of Tucker Carlson, Michael Flynn, and Roger Stone. Why is he so popular at home and abroad? And what are the consequences of the steady dismantling of democracy in the country? So, we have some exciting news. On Sunday, June 11th, at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be hosting a live Twitter space where you can become part of the conversation by asking questions or giving your thoughts on a topic.
Okay, hold on, Nita. For those of us not so online, what is a Twitter space?
Well, the first step is to have a Twitter account. I know that Twitter is awful these days, but you don't have to actually read any tweets to join us. Then you click on the link at the appointed time where a live conversation will begin. We'll have the link on all of our social media and in the show notes. Please do join us. I think it will be a lot of fun. We are co-hosting the event with another podcast, The Global Gambit. So there should be a good group of individuals interested in the latest topics and global events. So what is going on besides me still playing Zelda and all my free time?
Yeah, well, you've had an impressive streak with that, I have to admit. You're putting in the hours.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But yeah, no, the other thing that's been occupying our time is we're in the middle of house hunting, which is probably not a smart move because this is not a good market to be house hunting in, but it hasn't been good for 3 years. So basically since COVID, it's kind of the right time for us. We're looking, but yeah, I mean, I think like a lot of the country, it's a pretty frustrating experience for buyers currently.
It's horrible. I mean, it's hard to find the house you like. And then when you do, getting outbid by other people, it's just really frustrating.
Yeah, and it's a tough environment. Here in the U.S., with interest rates going up so much, people that maybe are looking to downsize or move, well, they don't really feel like they can because they probably got mortgages at much lower rates at 2 or 3%. So there's just a lack of inventory on the market. And then because interest rates are so high, that just makes a lot more expensive to purchase property because unfortunately prices haven't really come down either. So it's just kind of a double whammy effect, and it stinks for sure.
At first, it was like really fun to go to these different houses and look at them and think about the idea of having a house. And now it's like, I wish I could just see houses that I know I'm going to like. But there's no way to like do that and then making it easier to have a successful bid.
Yeah, and it's just that whole process. I came into it thinking, I mean, we all heard the stories during COVID of people coming in and bidding wars and waiving all contingencies and all cash buyers. And I kind of came in this year thinking, well, with interest rates being so high, all that stuff should be gone. But no, we put in a bid to a property with 5 other people. We went significantly above the asking price, but lost to a all-cash bidder who waived all contingencies, which just seems crazy to me.
Very. So if you are looking for houses, I do not recommend the DC metro area. but we keep plugging away. We're going to see some more houses tomorrow.
Yep.
Yeah. That's why I spend all my free time playing Zelda, because that's much
That's
more
good
fun.
stress relief. Yeah, that's right.
Exactly. So on with the show. So why don't you update us on the failed Russian winter offensive and what we think is going on with the counteroffensive by Ukraine that everyone is still waiting on?
Yeah, so I think it's safe to say, I mean, this has been a relatively quiet period during the war, but it's really a reflection of the fact of how spectacular the failure of the Russian winter offensive. If we recall, the Russians mobilized several 100,000 new recruits back in the fall. There was a lot of hype about them retaking some of the territory, both in the eastern part of the country and the south. And I think what we've seen is they've expended this huge amount of resources, but the fact is only a small percentage of Russian forces are actually capable of carrying out these offenses. And obviously they've concentrated it largely on the eastern front, so the Donbass in particular, concentrated on Bakhmut. And yeah, they just haven't seen much success at all. I mean, I think the biggest breakthrough that happened over the last couple of weeks is that finally the Wagner Group, supported by the regular Russian military, after months of fighting, after tens of thousands of casualties, has taken the city center of what's left of a completely devastated Bakhmut. That being said, the Ukrainians haven't given up Bakhmut. They've actually made advances on the flank, and they've kind of switched positions where Russia was playing an offensive role. Now the Ukrainians are looking to play an offensive role while the Russians try to dig in and defend what's left of Bakhmut, which is at this point has become just strictly a political symbol more than anything of strategic value.
Yeah, and I read one of the factors is that the Wagner Group is more of an offensive paramilitary organization. They're not built to be defensive. And so they're pulling back, and Russia is trying to hold the city with its regular troops. And so there's a question of whether that might make it easier for Ukraine to regain this territory.
Yeah, and I think, and it's been interesting seeing the political kind of consequences, because if we've talked about in previous episodes that to Wagner's founder, Prigozhin, this was always seen as a big political or significant political motivation in terms of him gaining credibility and power within the Kremlin. And he doesn't feel like he's been given credit for the victory within Bakhmut, and has actually been talking down the strategy, constantly complaining on the lack of munitions being given to the Wagner Group, and now kind of pulling out. But yeah, to your point, they are more of an offensive. And I think the one disturbing thing where they have been successful in the sense is that they were the ones that mobilized largely a criminal prisoner population and used them as a meat shield, frankly, to make these very painful advances and trench warfare. The New Yorker has an excellent piece kind of describing, embedded with a Ukrainian battalion that's been defending Bakhmut. And it just really gives you, it's very much reminiscent of something from World War I. I mean, just an absolute brutal environment. The advances it made successfully was because it had no conditions on human life. It was using prisoners to just overwhelm Ukrainian troops, which I don't know if you read that article, but the lack of equipment and supply that those troops defending Bakhmut had was pretty surprising.
So, yes, I definitely want to speak about the article. I was very moved by it, and it's definitely been something that just stays on your mind after you read it for a long period of time. We think of the Ukraine army, I think, at least I do, as a largely volunteer army, but it's actually, that was in the beginning, and now it's a largely drafted army. And so you never really think about the type of people who are drafted, people who are very ordinary, often manual jobs, who are not inclined even to the type of warfare, and they get almost no training, and they're sent to the front lines. it was interesting describing how some of the people there were just terrified and just trying to survive and would run away from the gunfire. In some sense, because I'd just been to Gettysburg, it made me think not in the conflict, but about stories in the Civil War. We have this portrayal in movies and things, and they're all follow orders very obediently. And I think anytime when you have just farmers and ordinary people being drafted, that they don't necessarily want to be there and they're not necessarily very good at it. And the people on the front lines in this situation, I mean, they know that it's likely that they won't survive. And I mean, it was really heartbreaking. And then, of course, this contrast with giving Ukraine so much modern equipment, and on the front lines of Bakhmut, the kind of aging equipment that they're like hot wiring to be able to do anything was really stark. And part of it is because Bakhmut is not very strategic, right? So they're not be given the resources really to survive because they want to employ those resources strategically in other places.
Right.
So these people are literally being sent to probably die to hold this non-strategic territory. So it was very moving and heartbreaking.
Yeah, and that part and the strategic element of it, the fact that the Western trained troops, which Michael Kaufman and Ryan Evans had an excellent update to their War in the Rocks podcast and went into the detail and kind of the numbers of a likely counteroffensive that, of course, everybody, the media has been heavily anticipating here. So it's about 9 battalions or so of fully Western equipped, but they've been purposely withheld. And it's kind of an experiment because these will be entirely Western equipped troops. They've been trained by NATO Western allies for weeks, for months. And it just stood in real contrast compared to your point, like with the Bakhmut, where these guys were being sent. I don't want to compare it to like the Russian prisoners being sent. I mean, they're being treated better than that, but they are sacrificial in the sense that they're not given the resources to really carry out their job purposely because Ukraine can't spare those resources because it's just strategically not important.
I mean, so you have the sense of Bakhmut, though, just being where these are not trained military, so they're just draftees who maybe have had at most a month
2
of
days.
training.
Yeah, they describe in the article, like the guy shot like 30 rounds in a rifle. That was the extent of his training with the gun, was 30
and that
rounds,
was someone
which is
who had
nothing.
a month-long training, where the others had as short as 2 days. So you get the sense of the whole Bakhmut just sending in waves of people on both sides, just willing to sacrifice as a number game. So
yeah, I mean, that being said, because they were on defense and in these trenches, they weren't necessarily like sending them to retake territory. I mean, I think what I find is it's remarkable. The Russians threw so much to such poorly equipped troops, and Ukraine held out for so long, given the condition and how decimated they were. But
I mean, the casualties on both sides are horrific.
And
there was a sort of knowledge that you were sending these people to die, essentially, to hold this non-strategic territory. And it's one of the, I think, frustrations of war that people are in this situation. And you have military leaders. I mean, maybe this is a decision that makes sense on some levels, but you also have like the leaders are so very distant from this type of warfare that's going on. And
and the fact that it is held up, and Kaufman goes in because he's asked directly, is it worth it? Was it worth this sacrifice? And basically saying that's something you can't judge right now. Maybe it will have shown to drain enough Russian resources that'll make this counteroffensive that Ukraine is playing more successful. But it's going to be something historians judge. But I thought the Economist article this past week was interesting, comparing it to Verdun. And Verdun, of course, was one of the most brutal battles within World War I between French and German troops, which over 300,000 died basically over a kilometer of territory. But is it going to be kind of this war's equivalent of this pointless sacrifice.
Yeah. And so the article is really, I highly recommend it, regardless of whether you're interested in technical details of war. It's something that doesn't romanticize the war, which I think happens too much when we talk about Ukraine, and gives you the reality. I don't know. I found it really impactful.
Yes, I think the other interesting story that came out staying with kind of the troops and the individual perspective on the ground was the Financial Times had a story about Gazprom. So the major public-private gas company that makes up a huge source of revenue. It's the owner of the Nord Stream pipelines. But it actually deploys its own fully funded battalions as well. And this apparently is something common as Russia faces manpower gaps and is reluctant to have another mobilization because of the political ramifications and the fact you had so many people trying to flee the country with the first mobilization, that some companies that try to position themselves politically are essentially asking their staff to have conscript within the army, where they become subsumed either by the Russian military itself. So they form these regiments. They're paid, though, by Gazprom. So they get bonuses above and beyond what they would get if they had gotten conscripted by the Russian military. But they still fall under the command structure of the Russian military, or even under Wagner. Now, Wagner doesn't like this at all because it's seen as a competition. You have all these billionaire oligarchs where it's the end thing. I can position myself for either a future without Putin or under a reconfigured Putin regime. And if I show that, hey, I spent my own money, I mobilized these troops, and I can brag about, oh yeah, they're having such great effect on the battlefield, even though none of these troops are. But it's this whole mercenary game that's being played, which is kind of crazy.
I think since the end of the Soviet Union, I think there's been this tendency to have these small warlords that Putin kind of really unified. I mean, that was one of the things that Putin did. But I think there's that tendency for them to be there. They just had to bow down to Putin's wishes, but they were still allowed to kind of run their own fiefdom.
Right.
And I think the success of Wagner has appealed to these people to have their own sort of mercenaries that then gets subsumed under the Russian military as a way of holding on to power or having their own base of power, because they see that with the head of Wagner. So I think it's a really interesting development. It's certainly a trend away from Putin's absolute power, although to what extent it really is, I don't know. But it is sort of people having their independent bases of power and hoping to make Putin more reliant on them, right?
Right. I found Gazprom the most interesting because it was also one of the more Western-facing entities within Russia. I mean, this was a company that part of its capitalization came from public Western markets. So it's listed. You could buy shares of Gazprom. It made ESG pledges to its shareholders. It sponsored huge professional soccer tournaments within Europe. And now eventually it's all in on supporting the Russian
Well, it sort of had
conquest.
to, right? Because of all the...
Yeah, it has no market anymore. Yeah,
right?
It's...
bans on oil to Europe and... Yeah.
But I think it's very symbolic of that complete separation that Europe now has with Russia, which was, of course, unimaginable before the conflict. But it was just, this really stood out as symbolic. Gazprom has its own battalion that's putting, and from a personnel standpoint, I thought it was interesting. They also want the ability to control who gets sent to the front from there. So they're still looking out for their corporate interest. They want to make sure that it's lower skilled, their security personnel is sent to the force as opposed to their engineers running the gas fields. So I thought that was another interesting element of it.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of another comparison and a war to that. It's definitely an interesting development. And like you said, I hadn't really thought about in the terms of what Gazprom is sort of its Western ties that it had before, but how since those ties have been severed.
Mm-hmm.
Then it's focusing on its own future and position within the Russian power game.
Yeah.
So I thought this started in foreign affairs and there was a response in Slate that I just thought the attention to the potential for NATO membership for Ukraine was really interesting debate that's going on.
Yes, I was surprised to see this surge so much where it seems like correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like the consensus now is after the war that NATO membership is far more likely for Ukraine than it was 4 or 5 months ago when we last discussed this, where it was always seen as too provocative. There's plenty of alternative structures that Ukraine can have. They'll still supply security. But now the talk is there should be a timeline and pathway. And you saw even opponents to it, like Henry Kissinger, have come out and said, now it makes sense. But yeah, going back to the Foreign Affairs article. So this came from the former defense minister of Ukraine. And he starts off the article making a very strong case for immediate ascension.
Well, that's what I think is kind of crazy.
Yeah, but then he kind of at the last paragraph of it acknowledges that that's not realistic, but that the goal for this upcoming, which I think is next week or certainly this month, of when NATO members meet, that there should actually be a firm timeline. Because this is something that has been on the table since 2008, but has always been, because you do have opposition, and still to this day you have opposition within certain NATO members, and it has to be a unanimous decision, as we've seen kind of with the discussions around Finland and Sweden for eventual admission into NATO. But I think a lot of the points that he made in terms of the strengths that a Ukraine would bring to NATO in terms of military capability are very credible.
Yes. I mean, so he just pointed out the type of what they would gain from having a tested Ukraine army. But it also would fundamentally, I think, change the nature of NATO, right? So if you think of how NATO started after War II, the rise of the Cold War with Russia, it was always European nations were nervous, and it was to have it's a defensive group, right? So it's basically about deterrence. Like if you attack one of us, then you attack all of us. And this means that you shouldn't try to do so. To have one of the provisions of membership is to have stable borders, which Ukraine is unlikely to have. So it changes things because you are including a country. I mean, even the idea of it may not have a settled conflict, depending on, it's hard to know what kind of agreement will come out of it. I think changes NATO's role and some of the fundamental partnership of it.
I can definitely see that point. And that's why I think it is definitely a post-war discussion. It depends on the terms of it. And maybe to the Kaplan piece in Slate, which argues against ascension, is that it's a key part of the bargaining and negotiation of an eventual peace process.
So I think Kaplan is more nuanced than what you say, because the Foreign Affairs article, the defense minister was like, it should happen now, which is insane.
Yeah, he says that, but he also acknowledges that that's not realistic. Also, what else is the former defense minister of Ukraine going to argue? I mean,
like to have a defensive alliance and then accept a country at war would...
Yeah, but I thought the nuance part of that argument was that Article 5 could be interpreted in a lot of ways. It doesn't mean that you're immediately declaring war, but that you're committing...
the purpose of the organization is not to like have members in an active war, right? If it's deterrence, you're saying... we're deterring, so don't attack us because you attack all of us.
But then how you choose to support the war effort is up to the individual.
But it's no longer
members.
About deterrence if you accept a country that's actively in war.
I agree. I think we can take that completely off the table. Even the fact that he took that off the table himself at the end of the article tells me that was never a realistic argument.
But I think that's what Kaplan is arguing about, is why you shouldn't do it in the middle of a conflict. Kaplan doesn't say you shouldn't ever do it.
No, he was saying that you shouldn't ever do it
I
almost.
didn't get that impression.
Well, yeah, just because he was putting all these stipulations where they wouldn't qualify, which I found really weak. I mean, yeah, the border one, depending on how it's negotiated, but the idea of it needs to be a liberal democracy. I'm like, what's Turkey and Hungary then doing in NATO? They're not credible democracies anymore either. I mean, all these other stipulations that he had in the article for not having Ukraine as a member are all weak. The only part,
to be fair, Hungary and Turkey were democracies when they joined. You can't really. The problem with the EU is that it's a qualification, but you can't.
Yeah, but I guarantee you, in terms of like corruption, these are never like well-run countries, even during admission into it. It's because of strategically.
Well, corruption-wise, Ukraine is way higher than any of those nations.
Hungary's pretty bad. Turkey's pretty bad too, as we've discussed.
Ukraine was like number one.
I agree, but Ukraine hopefully will emerge better so that it's at least on the level of a Hungary or Turkey at the end of the conflict.
I mean, we don't know. I think there's a lot of unknowns. You know, one thing I saw was intriguing is, even though I don't completely agree with it, is that part of a peace negotiation could be, we're going to have a ceasefire where the lines are now, which doesn't mean accepting Russian annexation, in fact, but in practical use, they would have that territory. To have a ceasefire, then you could have Ukraine be, or like in response to seizing at these lines, then Ukraine, you can become part of NATO. And so you'll have the extra protection of NATO. Right. That was intriguing.
The lines after the counteroffensive, essentially, whatever those are. And then and I think that makes sense. And I think even that represents a shift in the Overton window of where this whole discussion around NATO was before. I
totally think, and I'm not 100%, I agree with that. I mean, I think it's an interesting proposal, and if it does work as incentives for peace, then I'm okay with it. But like I said, I think it changes what NATO is. And I mean, NATO has shown full support. It's shown that you don't have to become part of NATO to be able to get that sort of support, particularly since the defense minister is saying the type of support that NATO is providing is the type of support that they would expect for it. It's not like they want to become NATO because they would get more support.
Yeah, and I think, and I see that. And I think it really depends on the nature of the negotiated peace and the nature of those borders, because I think if they come to a settlement, let's say Russia goes back to the pre-war borders. It still has Crimea. It still has large part of the Donbass. If they attempt to violate that, I think NATO is fully in its right to declare war for it to be what we kind of envision of NATO being, in that the United States and its allies are at war against an aggressive Russia. Right. So the whole idea
of letting Ukraine into NATO at that point is that you're not just giving Russia having time to regroup to attack you again, but that there'd be a much firmer.
And I think that creates a deterrence for Russia. I mean, Russia can, I don't know how you spin that internally, where if you hold on to Crimea and Donbass, but you have full NATO membership right on your board. That's the exact opposite of what they wanted to achieve strategically. I don't know how they spin that internally, but I guess Putin remains in power. But don't you think that creates enough of a deterrence for them to give up any further territorial gains?
So I think it works. I think it works in part of the peace negotiation. On the other hand, I don't know that, one, you say the lines that they had before, but it may include new territory that they've taken.
It all rests on this counteroffensive and how much they can hold then after that counter. Because, I mean, this is going to drag on for a while. The counteroffensive is not going to end the war.
Right.
It's then whatever territory they can take. And this will be like proof of concept of, okay, the West has supplied all this. The West has trained 9 modern battalions. How much territory can you take from these very reinforced positions in the South? I mean, that's going to be a big test. And again, the War in the Rocks podcast goes into that. And it's good to be interesting because these are very dug in Russian troops that aren't tested. These are conscripts, but at the same time, it's a lot harder to play offense than it is defense.
I think a successful counteroffensive will make the war go on longer because it will solidify Ukraine wanting total victory. And right now, I mean, it's just hard to see that either side is anywhere near a ceasefire because they still believe that they can obtain total victory. I fear that this is going to be a long, protracted war over years and one that's quite devastating.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that long term, which I think the other longer term move was and we've seen this throughout. We saw this about the Tiger main battle tanks, the M1s, and now we've seen it with the F-16s. Now the F-16s are going to play like zero role in this counteroffensive.
Probably zero role for a year.
They were saying it's going to be, like a year and a half before realistically they could be deployed. And then even then, the analysis that Kaufman had was that it's not like a guarantee of even like local air superiority, that the F-16, that the numbers can be provided, and it depends on how modern these F-16s, because this is a 30, 40-year-old plane. It's had a lot of different upgrades, so it depends on what planes they actually get.
Well, and I was struck by 20 hours of maintenance for every hour in the air.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's kind of the same with the M1. I mean, these are all like very maintenance intensive, sophisticated pieces of equipment. So, yeah, it takes a lot. Maybe they can be trained. Maybe they can get up flying within 4 months. But then it's that supply chain, its ability to maintain it over a period of time. That being said, you can strike from 500 miles away with these planes. They could be equipped, essentially with, because it's really about the ability to strike deep behind Russian lines. So between the F-16s and then what the Ukrainians will be potentially able to deploy in this counteroffensive is the cruise missiles. So the air-launched cruise missiles that could be equipped to the MiG-29s that the Ukrainians have, that the British supplied, that can strike every area of occupied Ukraine. So I think it's this gradual incrementalism. It's the fact that nobody's concerned about provoking Russia anymore, that's kind of gradually declined. And it's giving the belief that from NATO members that you should support Ukraine for victory, maybe even total victory. And it's just this change of mindset that's really interesting over time. And that plays into the whole NATO membership discussion too. Just this window has moved over the past couple of months.
I think the discouraging thing when Kaufman, was that his? When he's talking, and when people are saying, well, they won't really have an impact on the war because there'll be a year and a half, they're assuming the war will be over before a year and a half. And I think the discouraging thing about this is the war may not be over in a year and a half. And if you're thinking about total victory, you can still be thinking about total victory even after this counteroffensive, whether it goes well or not, because you have these new F-16s that are going to come online and hopefully change things. So that's our thoughts on that. So the U.S. right has a new darling of an international leader that they would like to emulate. And this time it is El Salvador's president. I'll leave the name pronunciation to you.
Yeah, so Nayib Bukele, so he's the 41-year-old president of El Salvador, this Latin America country that has struggled with violence, since the emerged from civil war a number of decades ago, and has really been one of the drivers for the crisis with U.S. immigration and refugees. So it's always been seen as a problem area within Latin America. So when he ran under his party, the New Ideas Party, in 2019, they successfully won the initial presidential term. Now, under the El Salvadorian Constitution, presidents are elected to a single 5-year term, according to the Constitution. And one of the things that, of course, now he's pushing for is to do away with that. But before that, it was kind of interesting because in his first term, so prior to the parliamentary elections that occurred in 2022, he faced opposition from the two existing established political parties. And kind of using the COVID situation. He was able to seize a significant amount of executive power, but probably the boldest move that he made, again, around all of this gang violence, was that during one of the debates for a critical piece of legislation, he had requested $100 million to be funded to this anti-gang task force, and wasn't getting agreement between the two established parties. And as a obviously very illiberal fascist move, ordered the military and police forces to occupy their parliament building. And later said in interviews that this is an obvious threat, that if they did not go along with this vote, that he would either remove them from power or shoot them or whatever. So that was seen as and that made a lot of headlines. Now, they did succeed in getting this anti-gang task force funded. And like you mentioned, the murder rate has come down sharply. Now, back in 2015, El Salvador had a murder rate that made it the murder capital of the world at about 105 homicides per 100,000. And since that time, it's come down to roughly 7, which puts it more in line with the U.S. So that being said, it wasn't just his election that led to this collapse. In fact, when the 2019 election happened, the previous government had already cut that murder rate in half. So while his policies have certainly had a big impact, and definitely at 40, 50, that rate is still significantly high, and getting it down to the U.S., it makes it one of the lowest from a homicide perspective, much lower than Mexico and some of its Latin America neighbors. It has come at the cost of significant waiving of civil liberty rights. And I think that's part of the appeal to the right, particularly within the U.S., is the fact that it got rid of what it views as certain niceties around the protection. So in 2022, they passed an emergency provision that allowed them to target the two gangs, so Barrio 13, and then, of course, the famous MS 13, which is featured a lot in Republican rhetoric in this country, to arrest and lock up without any sort of due process involved. And this was really enabled by the fact that the New Ideas Party and Bukele have an approval rating within the country of 86%, which allowed them to win 2/3 of the seats in the National Assembly in 2022. Now, under that process, he forced the retirement of about 1/3 of the judges and put in his own appointees, and he completely reshaped the Supreme Court, which is basically what allowed for this provision to waive civil liberties away for alleged criminals.
Yeah, which is really key. I mean, when you had the situation in Colombia where you had taken a lot of power because of the steps against the violence there, Uribe wanted to get rid of term limits and have a third term. And it was the Supreme Court who ultimately prevented that from happening. So if you can control the Supreme Court, then you can control a lot of the power decisions. I mean, even, it was interesting in Venezuela, Chavez rewrote the Constitution, but Bukele is not even trying to rewrite the Constitution. He's just changing the rules and having the courts back him up.
Yeah, but I think what's interesting, of course, you've seen this in Latin America more from the leftist side, but the fact is all of these policies are enormously popular. And I can sympathize with it when the level of violence from these gangs rises to such an extent. The Economist mentioned within the article that these two gangs suppress the GDP of the country by 16%. It no longer is a criminal act, but rather a full-on challenge to state power. And yeah, when it's that direct of a threat to the well-being of the average citizen, I could totally sympathize with the waiving of these rights in order to basically take on a threat of what is a terrorist organization or a rebellious group threatening the state government.
I completely agree. And I think if any time authoritarian leader makes sense, it's usually when you have so much insecurity. You do have Colombia as an example, which certainly did a lot of human rights abuses as it was trying to take back control. So at one point, significant parts of the country had been controlled by the FARC.
Right.
So, I mean, you had fighting back against them, you had a lot of human rights abuses too, but they managed to keep the government structure, at least a democracy. And so you can do that. But I'm sympathetic too here. What's more disturbing is how the right in the US is using this, wanting to get rid of civil liberties to improve, I don't know, security or whatever they think is wrong with the country is disturbing.
Yeah, and I think it's the deployment of these tactics in a country where the crisis is nowhere even comparable to what's occurring. I mean, I think when
There's
you
no
can point
crisis.
to, yes, crime has ticked up slightly to levels comparable to the late 90s, but nowhere near the peak of the late 80s and the early 90s in terms of murder rate or rather violent activity. But what's interesting about this guy is he's extremely online, very active on Twitter, which of course is how he was really highlighted and noticed by the likes of Tucker Carlson, Michael Flynn, and Roger Stone, who have kind of highlighted him as a role model, in that he kind of returns the favor. So he is quoted in interviews saying, I'm from El Salvador, a third world country in Central America, and I myself see cities in the US and say, I wouldn't live here. So he told this to Tucker before Tucker got canned. The demise of the US has come from within. No external enemy can cause this much damage. So here this guy is understanding US politics very well and their internal, and understanding the red meat.
He is a populist, so he understands populism.
Yeah, so it's feeding that red meat and also comparing U.S. cities, which are nowhere near the level of kind of the crisis that he's had to deal with in El Salvador, but still linking those two and providing kind of the strength where, they right here, as we've seen, would love to get rid of civil liberties and deploy these, frankly, harsh, but I think necessary tactics that are employed in places like El Salvador and employ them within U.S. cities.
Well, there is a question of how far do you go to crush civil liberties, even dealing with sort of the gang violence that El Salvador was? I mean, do you need to restructure the Supreme Court to favor whatever you want to do? There's a lot of corruption. His brothers are the most influential power brokers. So there's a lot of things that are not related at all to bringing security, but about expanding its own power. But like I said, I understand authoritarianism or leaning toward it when there's a big security crisis, when you're the murder capital of the world, or even. But in the United States, it's funny because I was like, a lot of Europeans said they wouldn't live in these cities because there's too much gun violence, because there's too much guns, right? I mean, you can look at violence in different ways in the US. But I think anytime it's being used to dismantle civil liberties, right? And it's a huge question of how that would help anything or improve anything, except allowing them to go after their perceived enemies.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And I think it's indeterminate right now whether that makes sense, and two, if his popularity levels will remain. So this entire approach, I mean, the Economist noted in its article of this duro, so the iron fist sort of approach has been applied before in Latin America. You talked about Colombia, but it was also deployed in Guatemala to an even more extreme extent in 2004, where they had extrajudicial killings of gang members. And it was effective for a while, but then those murder rates surged immediately back up. And it never addressed the underlying reasons on why a gang life would be appealing to young men within the country. And it's just the lack of economic opportunities. So will El Salvador be able to use this lower level of violence to invest in education, invest in infrastructure, invest in the things that make gang life unappealing? And that's an open question, because if he just uses this to enrich his family, which in lock-in power, then he's no better than any other dictator you've seen on the left side within Latin America.
He's not going to be any more successful.
Right.
So if he really wanted to be a successful dictator, he would bring economic development. I mean, certainly that's what you have, like Park Chung-hee in South Korea.
Yep.
You know, the longing for those days sometimes is not just reduction in violence, but the economic development, taking opportunities for that. And obviously, authoritarian leaders can do that, but there's always so much corruption. And is there enough left over for the rest of the economy is definitely questionable.
Yeah, and I think his whole experimentation with crypto too.
Right, that's
back
what I
in
was gonna
2021,
say.
22. It's not encouraging, like around economic. He's acts more like
a also how he became so popular with the right.
Right, with the libertarian right. Yeah. Yep.
Was the adoption of Bitcoin and trying to put significant amount of countries' money.
Yeah, he made it like an officially accepted currency in 2021. I think one of the few countries to do so at a national scale, and then invested at least 70, 80 million in crypto, like at the absolute wrong time, like right around the Super Bowl when that was all being promoted here, and ended up losing 70% of that when crypto crashed. So if that's kind of like an indication of where his economic priorities are and investments in the country, it doesn't seem like a good sign that he can use this window to actually improve the material well-being of the people.
I mean, you have to have, I think, some sort of corporate leaders or already corporate civil society or business civil society that was suppressed that can now operate better. So sometimes even corruption is a bad thing, always. But you can have corrupt enterprises still have economic development if there's enough overflow from the corruption. So can you empower the right people or graft for the right people who know what they're doing economically?
Yeah, I mean, I know their biggest push, I think, has been around tourism. I pulled up here, so one of the ads from Twitter targeted for Americans, particularly on the right specifically. It's a very Norman Rockwell photo of an older couple, 1950s style, and basically saying El Salvador, the new land of the free, appealing to all the low crime, and as this place as either a retirement place for Americans or, as a tourist destination. So I don't know if that's kind of the idea of initial economic stimulus for the country, is to attract more Americans to vacation there, particularly conservative Americans.
I don't know in terms of economic development that you can try to create a new tourist industry. I mean, there has to be some fundamental economic capital that you can build upon. What is the basis for the economy in El Salvador? And I really don't know. But can you provide opportunities to be more successful, to other farmers be more successful? Or, I mean, do you have the base of those farmers to provide those goods?
Right. And does this become an area where China enters with the Belt and Road Initiative, and maybe seeing it, given their more cautious investment approach now, they see the lower crime rate, they see a government that frankly is more simpatico to the Chinese way of governing society, whether there's investment, whether he'll take advantage of that, which kind of runs counter then to him trying to romance the right within the country, because he had Marco Rubio come down. And I think Rubio had a more nuanced approach. Again, he's more established Republican, less MAGA. And it was from this real politics side of, well, this guy's doing what's necessary in order to get crime and violence, and that'll create less of a crisis around immigration on our borders. So we should support this guy because he has been targeted by the Biden administration, again, under what we've talked about as probably a failed approach of democracy versus autocracy. I don't know if Bukele was excluded from the whole American conference that was held in the US or Mexico? Mexico didn't go, But I don't know if El Salvador is one of those sanctioned. But the Bukele administration has been sanctioned by the Biden, and Rubio has been very critical of that from this more real politics standpoint of this guy's doing what's needed to stabilize the governments in these areas.
I mean, I think that's more understandable position. But this idea that we need to erode civil liberties to have security is just wrong and scary.
Yeah, I don't get, I mean, I get it, but I mean, El Salvador is far more sympathetic than a place like Hungary or Orban, which is far more of a power grab, and that's not driven by any sort of external crisis or internal crisis compared to El Salvador. But yeah, the right just wants to be able to, frankly, take gang members and shoot them in the back of the head without a trial. I mean, that's their fantasy for sure.
Yeah.
Yes, I think it'll be interesting. That election's coming up in 2024. It does look like he'll definitely run for a second term. He's looking to try to export this model. I know he's set up a similar political party inspired by the New Ideas Party within Guatemala and has attempted the same in Costa Rica. But I think, like we mentioned, that comes down to, can he take this window of lower violence, which has proven to be transient, with other people that apply this iron fist approach, and can he actually make a material impact on the well-being of the country?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I predict he wins.
Oh, yeah. 86%. I predict he wins too. Yeah.
I predict he could be out there for a third term. So next is my interview with Deborah Larson. And like I said, I think we had a really interesting discussion on the nature of the Russia-China partnership, which is still a subject that's been intriguing as it came shortly before the war in Ukraine and China's position that it's taken during the war, where it has shown support for Russia despite some of its earlier issues that they had with territorial integrity, which they had actually made statements against Russia in 2014, but have been silent, of course, on this. So just talked about what's driving that, their support for Russia, even though the war is definitely costing them some alliances, but do the gains of that make up for it? And a question that a lot of people have asked, Putin, last thing his ego can tolerate is being the junior partner. And yet Russia seems so obviously the junior partner in the relationship. So how do they think of themselves in not being in that position? So I hope you enjoy. My name is Dr. Anita Kellogg, and I'm here with Deborah Larson, a research professor of political science at the University of California, Los Angeles. She specializes in status concerns, Russian and Chinese foreign policies, and the liberal world order. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you for having me. It's good to talk about these issues. A lot is going on.
Absolutely. And certainly one of the things we wanted to talk more about is the China-Russia relationship. And I read a chapter of yours in the book, and I was like, oh, she's the perfect person to have on to talk about this. So we're really excited to have you here. I want to begin with the foundation of the China-Russia relationship. On a surface level, they seem to have perhaps more differences than commonalities. For example, Russia accuses China of setting up de facto settlements on its territory in eastern Russia. They have disputes over fishing rights in the Arctic. They are both vying for influence in Central Asia, including former Soviet republics. And then, of course, there's the Soviet-Sino split in 1961 over who would represent communism. So what is the basis for their alliance now?
You're absolutely right, Anita, about their differences. Their partnership is not based on friendship or trust. It's really based on their position as outsiders from the liberal world order and the desire for greater status. Both are former great powers that entered a period of decline with the end of the Cold War, which seemed to discredit communism. When the Cold War ended in 1989 to 90, both were left outside the circle of established powers. They were regarded as outsiders from the US-dominated liberal world order. Russia, under Yeltsin and Kozyrev, briefly tried to join the West, but they were not accepted because Russia did not meet the test of a liberal democracy. And this is something that is a matter of some irritation to Russian elites. China, on the other hand, was criticized after the Cold War ended because of Tiananmen Square, its human rights abuses. It was regarded as a backlash state. And there were also tensions in Taiwan. So beginning in the mid-1990s, both states moved towards each other as a way of getting greater respect from the West. And their resentment over being outsiders is compounded by history of humiliation at the hands of Western powers. And I think we have to remember that humiliation. China has often referred to 100 years of humiliation, beginning with the Opium War in 1842. Whereas Russia, even though it's a Western power, supposedly, also suffered humiliations. There were the defeats in the Crimean War in 1854 to 56. There was Russia's defeats in World War I, which contributed to the Bolshevik Revolution. And there was the fact that Russia simply was ostracized by the West after it underwent the Communist Revolution. So they had this history of grievances, and both feel that they deserve a place at the top of the table among the elite powers. But they blame the United States and the West for not giving them the recognition that they deserve. So the partnership isn't really based, as you say, on love or cultural commonality, but it's based on these shared status grievances. The Chinese have long privately held contempt for Russians. They regard them as barbaric, like for centuries. Whereas Russia has always defined itself as a European power. And why? Because Europe has higher status than Asia. So I think both states would have preferred to have been recognized and accepted by the West, but that didn't happen. And so beginning in the mid-1990s, they moved towards each other. But the relationship with the United States has undergone cycles. Whenever their relationship with the United States improves, they kind of move away from each other. But when it deteriorates, they move towards each other. But Putin conclusively moved towards China after 2014 when the West imposed sanctions. So that's where we are today.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point and something we don't take into account enough when we make these sort of analysis, that both of the feeling of humiliation and both feeling like outsiders to the Western world order. What are the goals for each country to get out of the relationship?
Well, for China, partnership with Russia helps support its claims to be a global great power. Xi Jinping has been saying for some time that the world is undergoing changes not seen in the last 100 years, and that it's moving towards multipolarity. Well, if it's moving towards multipolarity, there has to be another power besides China and the United States. At their last summit, Xi turned to Putin and said, let's drive those changes together. Now, in order for China to claim that there is a multipolar world order, China has to delegitimize the US-dominated liberal order, undermine the values underlying those orders. And it's interesting that at the February 4 summit, before Russia invaded Ukraine, both China and Russia set themselves up as models of democracy. So together, they can claim that they present a different set of values, one that is perhaps even more attractive than the liberal values underlying the Western order. Sovereignty, non-interference in internal affairs, a strong state, and so on. But in addition to those concerns about values and recognition, China has economic and strategic interest. China benefits from cheap Russian oil and gas. Russia is a supplier of advanced military equipment. And given the deteriorating Chinese relationship with the US, she needs the United States, needs Russia, as a counterweight to the US. Now, on Russia's part, Putin needs China to avoid international isolation. When she visited Moscow in March of this year, Putin had just been declared a war criminal by the International Criminal Court. So Xi's visit helped sort of rescue Putin from complete disapprobation by the international community. And with China's support, Russia can claim that in fighting in Ukraine, it is actually fighting for a multipolar world order. It's not just fighting the West, it's not just fighting Ukraine, it's joined with China together in support of an emerging, more just multipolar world order. And it's important to Russia that China supports Russia's rationalization for the war in Ukraine, that it was caused by NATO expansion. And most important, China props up the Russian war machine, buying a third of Russian exports by buying its oil and gas and providing it key components that it needs to keep its economy going under the Western sanctions.
So I want to pick up on one of your comments there. And I know China has this history of making statements about territorial integrity. And they even made one of those statements in 2014 about the Ukraine, about Russia's taking over Crimea. How overall is China squaring its longstanding position on territorial integrity and what Russia is doing in Ukraine?
China doesn't try to square it. It hedges and it talks about Russia's security interests and indivisible security, and it just completely ignores Ukraine's right to sovereignty and territorial integrity. So China is really showing double standards, the double standards that it accuses the United States of. And I think that Xi's support for Russia, despite its violation of the norm of sovereignty, which is very important to China, going back to the principles of peaceful coexistence in the 50s. The fact that Xi has done this suggests that the relationship is not entirely rational, that's based to some extent on emotions rather than principle.
Yeah, and of course, that's such an interesting perspective in IR that's really hard to account for when we try to analyze relationships, is the role of emotions in it. So to many, Russia is clearly the junior partner of this relationship, particularly in terms of its economic size and global influence. Yet Putin is unlikely to accept such a status. How does Russia see itself not becoming a junior partner in the relationship?
Well, you're right. One reason why Russia has avoided becoming too dependent on China is that it doesn't want to be the junior partner, or what some have called the younger sister. And this is a serious fear because, when the Cold War ended, China and Russia's economies were roughly aligned. China was a little bit behind Russia. And now China's economy is 10 times the size of Russia's. So there's that inherent asymmetry. But Russia does not want to be inferior. Putin does not want to be inferior in status to China. What Putin would like is an equal partnership of unequals. I mean, he knows that, Russia's economy is way behind China's, its clout, but he still does not want to be considered inferior. So how is he going to make up for that? Well, you could say that Russian elites rationalize, Putin rationalizes by saying that Russia is a great military power. Despite their poor, lackluster performance in Ukraine, Russia is still a great military power. And it's true that Russia has some advantages over China in the military area. Russia has advanced technology in certain areas that China would like nuclear submarine technology, fighter engines, their air defense systems. And Russia has combat experience. China has not fought a war since 1979, and that was against Vietnam, which is, not a developed state, although certainly a formidable military opponent. But China doesn't have any military experience. And so you could say that Russia is trying out weapons and tactics and can share that experience with China. Russia also has natural resources that China needs, like oil and gas. Russia would like to be the leading supplier of natural gas to China. And so it wants to build more pipelines to replace the ones that it formerly had with Europe, which have been shut down due to the war. But China isn't really playing along with that. China does not want to be dependent on any state for energy. And so at the most recent summit between Xi and Putin, Xi did not agree to the power of Siberia too, which is what Putin was pushing, another pipeline towards Siberia.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of thinking about things and just how Russia manages that perception itself when, of course, the rest of the world sees even seeing Russia as a commodity exporter to China is certainly in some ways solidifies their junior standing. But I think it was interesting the way you point out that in the ways that they have some military superiority or technology that China wants, because we tend to think, and this is kind of reinforced by the Ukraine war, as Chinese military equipment being old and out of date. So that's interesting.
Well, the Chinese have gotten to be a lot better at producing military equipment. Earlier, Russia wouldn't sell certain systems to China because they knew that China would reverse engineer the technology and do it and implement it itself. But now Russia has accepted that it really has no choice but to give technology to China, even if it does result in the long run in the loss of their military superiority. Russia really is in a bad position right now, and it's difficult to see how they can avoid becoming just a junior partner. Some Russian elites fear becoming a resource appendage of China, basically a third world country selling China oil and gas and resources while China reaps, the economic advantages. But given the war in Ukraine, which was really a blunder on the part of Putin, Russia really has no choice.
Do they worry about China taking that engineering process and then competing with them and selling weapons around the world? Because I know that is one of the things that's led to India's not taking a stronger stance against Russia is because they get so much military equipment. And Russia sells a lot in Africa, I know, and through the Wagner Group. So I'm just curious if that's something that they consider.
I think it's a consideration. It's definitely a consideration. They might hold back some of their most advanced equipment for fear that China will steal their business. And the arms sale business is not just about economics. It's also about strategic relationships,
right,
making other states dependent on Russia so that, like India and Vietnam, they won't oppose Russia too strongly in international fora.
Yeah, no, and that's interesting. And when you look at some of the relationships in Africa too, that definitely have noted that the military ties with the elites forms a lot of the underlying relationships that Russia has in Africa and perhaps other parts of the world. So I mentioned some of their differences. Where in general would you say that their goals do not align?
Right now, the war in Ukraine is creating big difficulties for China. It's disrupted global supply chains. It's made it more difficult for China to trade freely because of the risk of running afoul of the United States and having sanctions imposed on some of its companies. And in general, China is more economically interdependent with the rest of the world than Russia. Russia is not that dependent on the rest of the world. And so Russia's free to be a disruptor. Russia would be happy to see chaos in the international economic system, whereas China needs stability. China, unlike Russia, is relying on economic power for its claim to global power status. And the war has also created difficulties for China in its relationship with Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Europe is still China's leading trading partner. And the European countries were already suspicious of China, but its tacit and sometimes overt support for Putin's war in Ukraine has caused a lot of suspicions among European countries and caused them to move closer to the United States and to be more receptive to US claims that they need to cooperate against China. It just creates a lot of suspicion. EU officials want China to criticize Russia's aggression, but Xi Jinping will not do that. So there's just increased disharmony, and it could create potential problems for China in its trading relationship with the EU. China also objects to Putin's nuclear threats. He's raising the prospect of nuclear war. Xi Jinping issued a statement against that, the Chinese, and so far Putin has backed down, but he may very well start doing that again. And China doesn't want nuclear coercion to be used because right now it's still inferior to the United States in the number of nuclear weapons. And so some Chinese elites think that Putin has taken advantage of Xi. And privately, they would prefer for Xi to sort of move away from Putin. They have far more economic stakes in relations with the West, and China's economy isn't doing that well. But Xi has doubled down, which again, to me, suggests that there's more to the relationship than simply economic and strategic interests. There's real emotional ties based on their shared status as outsiders and aggrieved powers that interferes with rational thinking. Now, on Russia's part, the big conflict is over Central Asia. As you mentioned before, Russia regards Central Asia as its sphere of influence. These states were formerly part of the Soviet Union. Even after the breakup of the Soviet Union, the leading Central Asian states are tied to Russia by economic links, shared culture, the Russian diaspora, ties between elites, and their shared status as autocracies with strongmen. But China has long aspired to have a greater role in Central Asia, partly for status, partly for economics, and partly for security. In terms of status, China would like to be a Eurasian power, and the Central Asian states would connect it to Europe, allowing it to avoid Russia. There's also economic reasons. Several of the Central Asian states are rich in oil and gas, and China does not want to be dependent on any state for energy. And China is also concerned about the security of Xinjiang, terrorism. And these states, some of them have their own problems with terrorism. So China needs to cooperate. So for the past 20 or 30 years, there's been this potential for status rivalry between China and Russia in Central Asia.
Yeah.
But they've managed to prevent it because they have a division of labor. Russia is responsible for security. China is responsible for economics. So Russia provides peacekeeping forces and helps put down terrorist operations, uprisings, whereas China provides loans for infrastructure and trading cooperation and so forth. Then this has worked out pretty well until now, when Russia can't really fulfill its security responsibilities because of its involvement in Ukraine. It does not have the military forces to maintain security in Central Asia. And it's telling that in October, Russia did not intervene in the territorial dispute between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The Central Asian states themselves have been alienated by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I mean, Kazakhstan says, why not us?
Right.
Kazakhstan also has a substantial Russian population. And so none of the Central Asian states have given support to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Well, this creates a golden opportunity for China to move in. There's a power vacuum, and China's taking advantage of this. Just this last week, on May 18th to 19th, China convened a summit with the 5 Central Asian powers by itself, with Russia not involved. And one of the leading topics of conversation was security cooperation, which suggests that China's moving into Russia's area of responsibility. Yeah. So some experts believe that this is only the beginning of status competition, status rivalry between China and Russia in Central Asia. And I don't see that Russia is in much of a position to do much about it, given its entanglement in Ukraine. So we'll have to see.
Yeah. Is China capable, though, of taking over that security role? And, we really haven't seen Chinese troops engage anywhere across the world. So that would be interesting. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, China has deliberately not put troops in Central Asia. Well, actually, it has done so surreptitiously without anyone knowing, but the intelligence got out. So in the past, China did provide peacekeeping forces to the UN, when it was trying to be a responsible power. So, it could place its forces in between two, rival countries that are feuding over border. And China also has substantial surveillance capabilities that it would be only too eager to share with the countries to help them deal with the threat of terrorism. Mm-hmm. I mean, look what China has done to Xinjiang, basically turned it into a totalitarian state. And they could do the same for the Central Asian countries if they wanted that. But I'm not sure that the terrorism threat is that significant.
Yeah, no. So those are some really good points. How much support from China has Russia expected? Like, are they getting the support that they want? For example, are they surprised or disappointed that they have not received weapons from China for the Russia-Ukraine war? Or do they just, because that relationship is based on something else, they expect or accept the current status?
Well, absolutely. I think they are disappointed with the fact that China has not given them weapons and ammunition, especially now when they have a serious shortage of ammunition. And this is an example of how China treats the relationship with Russia as transactional. China does not want to incur Western sanctions because it would hurt its trade. So China is not providing Russia with the ammunition and the equipment, the tanks and so forth that Russia desperately needs. Now, if the two of them were really allies, which they were not, China would do so. So I think Russia is disappointed. And according to U.S. intelligence, Russia has made a number of requests for lethal aid. And China has hedged and hawed and just not given them what they wanted. But again, Russia doesn't have much choice. It doesn't have any alternative but to rely on China, because at least it gets economic support from China, which is better than nothing. But yeah, I think that China has not fulfilled Russian expectations. On the other hand, the Russians may recognize that China is only in it for Chinese interest and that they have to expect this. I mean, China certainly hasn't shown much willingness to sacrifice for Russia. It's bargained hard and gotten a good price for oil and gas and other resources. And China's taken advantage of Russia's economic needs. So again, it's a sign that there's an asymmetric relationship where Russia basically has to take what it can get from China. Now, in the long run, that could create tensions, just like the ones that led to the Sino-Soviet split.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. So that's interesting and something that I've been thinking about. What do you think of the future of this relationship? Where is it heading?
As long as China's challenging the United States for predominant influence over the world order, I think they will continue to be aligned with each other. Because, as I said, China needs Russia to oppose the United States. The United States has many, many allies. It has this whole alliance network, whereas China has no real allies. And so China needs Russia if it wants to set itself up as a pole. And increasingly, it seems as though the world is becoming more polarized. China and Russia against the US, Europe, and Japan. Just like the Cold War, it seems to be blocks. Now, one possible difference and one thing that could sort of alleviate this polarization is the fact that the global South and medium and smaller countries in the global South are playing the great powers off against each other.
Mm-hmm.
In order to get more. And with globalization, they can do that. They can avoid. So to that extent, it prevents a complete return to Cold War polarization. But still, as long as China aspires to be equal or superior to the US, I think it will continue its relations with Russia. And so long as Russia is an outsider from Europe, I think it will be so long as Putin is in power, Russia will stay with China.
Yeah, so those are some really good thoughts about that future and something I definitely concur with. So thank you so much for being here and talking with us and sharing your insight.
Thank you, Anita. I'm very pleased to talk about these issues, even though they're a little depressing. But we need to be cognizant of what draws the two powers together, because if China did help Russia in the Ukraine war, it would be very, very serious. And so if there is some means of wooing Russia away from China to some extent or vice versa, we need to be alert to that. So we need to see what draws them together to think about how we can perhaps separate them a little, maybe put a little bit of daylight between them.
Right. And I know that's something that has been part of U.S. foreign policy and is just made really difficult by Putin really putting all his cards into China. But hopefully something in the future will allow that for. Yeah, too much of what we discuss sometimes is depressing. But like you said, it's really important to understand the issues and maybe have some hope for optimism in the future. Well, thank you so much. Thanks. And goodbye.
Goodbye.
I hope you enjoyed listening to the interview. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Kellogg's Global Politics. You can visit our website at www.kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and follow us on Twitter at Global Kellogg or me, AR Kellogg.
You can also reach us by email. So Anita at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com and myself, Ryan at kelloggsglobalpolitics.com. And as always, please see the show notes for the articles we discussed in this episode. And if you like this show, please take time to tell your friends, share it on your social sites. It's a simple, quick, and free way to support the show.
And don't forget to join us Sunday, June 11th for our live Twitter space.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.